think we are just about ready. Thank you everyone for coming to our panel on governing water supplies. I'm just here to introduce our wonderful moderator. I'm Professor Joanna Gogert from the University of Maryland, College Park. She's part of their Environmental Science and Policy program, and she's going to be introducing our panelists.
Thank you everyone for attending our governing water supply panel today, for choosing this panel to attend. What I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers, and then I thought it might be nice for us to go around the room and just briefly tell us your name and where you work and what your interest is in terms of water, and then that will help us maybe be able to focus our discussion since we're sort of a small group. So our two speakers today, the first speaker is Dr. Rebecca Bates. She is a lecturer in law at Brunel Law School in the United Kingdom. The focus of her work is European and international environmental law, and she has a specific interest in water, and I was looking at her list of recent publications and was very fascinated and interested by a piece that she's working on, I believe, that I found on the internet on the comparative water law of Australia and South Africa. So that is going to be in the Denver Water Law Review? Yes. Is it already published or is it soon? I think it's next. Okay, great. And she's going to be, I thought she would be best to go first because she's going to talk about the specific outcomes of the Rio Plus 20 conference with respect to water supply. So she'll be speaking first, and then our second panelist is Professor Nicola Bucaresi from the Trento School of Law in Italy, in northern part of Italy. And he is a professor of administrative and environmental law and also has a specific focus on water law. And he will be talking in a little bit more of a focused context on the European Union and their water governance structure, and in particular further focus on Italy. So if we could just quickly, before they begin, just maybe start over here and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Laura Stone. I work for the Department of Justice in Ottawa, and just as a general interest in the subject.
Hi, my name is Willem Bergthaler. I'm from Vienna in Austria. I'm actually an attorney, but also lecturing law at the University of Linz. I'm lecturing water law there, and I have an interest because Austria has a surplus of water. We always have a discussion of selling our water to others, but how it is possible to make water as good, or if it is in the public domain, and that's what's interesting today.
Hi, I'm Kelly Proctor, and I work for Marstel Day. We're an environmental consulting and conservation firm based out of Northern Virginia, and we do land conservation for military bases, and part of our analysis includes water conservation, so excited to hear what you have to say.
We go back over here real quickly. We're just introducing ourselves briefly.
Oh, I'm Chris Breakwell. I work at the USDA in DC on water pollution. That's the closest to what I work on.
I'm Lori Schechtel. I'm a 99 graduate of this law school here. I work for the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, which is our water department in the Bay Area, up at Hetch Hetchy and Yosemite National Park, and I deal with all of our Clean Water Act permitting for our transmission system, our facilities, and natural resource protection on watersheds.
Good morning. I'm Emmanuel Kasimbazi. I'm from Uganda. I teach environmental law and policy. At the same time, I'm a consultant. I'm actually reviewing the water law and act in Uganda. And one of the issues is really the issue of water supplies. Actually, there's even a conference, I think, of the International Water Association. And I'm going to present a paper on water, on the quality of drinking water. So that's why actually when I saw the session, I would want to see how it is done in Italy, so that I improve my paper.
Hi, this is Shaukat Alam. I'm senior lecturer in law at Macquarie Law School, Australia. I'm also director of Center for International Environmental Law at Macquarie. What brings me here is my interest in the international trade aspect of water supply. I'm particularly interested in how water is regulated by international trade law, particularly WTO Agreement on Trade and Services. And I have published in this area as well. So for it to be a really interesting session.
Jackie Williams, I'm from the Australian Centre for Agriculture and Law at the University of New England. So I'm a senior researcher there. We've done some work on policy risks for tradable water rights in Australia, so I'm interested to hear what happens elsewhere, and we've looked at the whole sustainability challenge of the Murray-Darling in particular in Australia.
My name is Paul Kybell. I'm a law professor at Golden Gate University School of Law in San Francisco, where I teach a water law seminar every semester, and areas I focus on a lot are water rights and water supply, in-stream flow for fisheries, and also transboundary water supply issues, particularly in California with US-Mexico.
Hi, my name is Mallory Montgomery. I'm a student here at the law school, and I'm working with Professor Percival this summer to do research for him and helping out with his curriculum this year.
Hi, I'm Andrew Keir. I'm a fellow with the Environmental Law Clinic here at the University of Maryland, and we do several cases involving Clean Water Act. I guess my interest in water appropriation and conservation is a more personal interest, as we don't work on that right now.
Hi, I'm Erin Dorn. I'm also a fellow at the Environmental Law Clinic here, so I'm interested.
Okay, great. Well, we will go ahead and get started with Dr. Rebecca Bates.
Thank you very much for my introduction, and also I'm very interested in hearing about everyone's specific interests in the area, and hopefully some of my thoughts on Rio might be able to, shall we say, sort of start some discussion on our collective interests at the end of the session. Okay, so sorry, can I just, oh, there you go. Okay, Okay. So the supply of water involves a complex and competing framework of ecological and humanitarian considerations, with water being simultaneously both an ecological, economic and humanitarian service. Now we know at present we've got about 800 million people without access to drinking water and around 2.6 billion without access to adequate sanitation. Now the international community descended on Rio last week to try and broker yet another agreement to achieve sustainable development. In echoes of the World Summit on Sustainable Development, it placed a strong emphasis on poverty reduction and development. However, departing from previous initiatives, the future we want places its support behind the green economy as a means to simultaneously achieve development and environmental protection. So this paper is going to look at the outcomes of Rio+20 with respect to water resources and supply. It will consider the role of water within the wider green economy and ask what the objectives of the green economy are for water and whether they are achievable. So firstly, I briefly want to talk about the outcomes for Rio. I know we spent a panel session discussing those, but I just want to quickly have a look through the outcomes with respect to water and consider their broader implications. So perhaps it's too soon, a week after the conference, to, as we discussed in the last session, to write it off as a failure. It was always going to be difficult returning to Rio, invoking its iconic status and that of its predecessor Stockholm, to meet expectations and to provide an effective means of achieving both sustainable development and a plan to manage all the media-specific issues, environmental issues, which the world are facing. It is clear, however, that the future we want is focused on poverty reduction and is yet another attempt by the international community to devise a means to achieve sustainable development. Now, the issue of water and water supply received, shall we say, slightly limited attention during the conference. It's mentioned 32 times in the final text of The Future We Want, with paragraphs 119 to 24, specifically dealing with the issues of water and sanitation. However, little of this discussion, from my perspective, added a great deal to the existing body of instruments already focused on the issue. And the outcome of the conference, the outcome with respect to water is perhaps symbolic of the outcome of the conference. Bjorn Lomborg commented at The Guardian that the UN had intentionally chose to focus on trendy issues like water, like global warming and the green economy, instead of the banal but much more important issues such as water and air pollution. Now, before I delve too much into the outcomes of the conference and sort of engage in the discussion of those, I do specifically want to go through the specific outcomes in paragraphs 119 to 124. So firstly, we have the future we want recognises water as being at the core of sustainable development. It reaffirms the commitments made in the Johannesburg Plan of Implementation and Millennium Declaration to halve by 2015 the number of people without adequate water and sanitation. It reaffirms the commitments regarding the human right to safe drinking water and sanitation. However, interestingly, these are to be progressively realised with full respect to national sovereignty. It recognises the key role that ecosystems play in maintaining water quality. It underlines the need to adopt measures to address floods and droughts and water scarcity. And it also stresses the need to adopt measures to significantly reduce water pollution and increase water quality. Now, I briefly want to sort of deconstruct a few of these outcomes. In terms of the impact of the future we want with respect to the access to clean and safe drinking water, we can see that it provides another affirmation of the right to water, drawing upon the recent developments in the United Nations General Assembly and of course also the Human Rights Council. However, as I sort of my tone of voice indicated, it is very interesting that it is to be progressively realised with full respect to national sovereignty. Now, the words of progressive realisation are interesting in the fact that they're drawing upon the language of Mazabiku, and whether they're doing this intentionally, the South African Constitutional Court decision, and whether it's doing it intentionally or unintentionally, I'm sure we're all aware of the challenges that that judgment has presented for expanding water access. And so in this way, linking it with the recognition of the right to water, I think we can say that it's imposing a small chilling effect on the recognition, or sorry, I should more say the realisation of the right, because of course there's no sense of positive obligation linked up with the right that it is recognising. It's also disappointing that this language is being used in the future we want when the Stockholm Declaration was the first instrument to formally recognise the right to conserve water resources, and also can be viewed as the original source of the direct recognition of the right to water. Secondly, looking at the reaffirmation, we've got the reaffirmation of the Millennium Development Goals and the Johannesburg Plan of Implementation. This is clearly in line with the overall theme of poverty reductions. The Johannesburg Plan of Implementation, like the Millennium Development Goals, committed to halving the number of people without access to clean drinking water and sanitation by 2015. Now, the Millennium Development Goals have been generally viewed as being successful with respect to water, and they believe the UN estimates that they will have reduced the number of people without access from 1.2 million at their inception to around 800 million in 2015. They, however, have not been as successful with respect to sanitation, with the numbers still currently hovering around 2.6 billion and estimated to increase to 2.7 billion by 2015. In this context, though, the mention of the Johannesburg Plan of Implementation is also interesting, as this was, as the Johannesburg Plan of Implementation placed a heavy emphasis on public-private partnerships as a means to expand water supply. Privatisation is also mentioned in other areas of the future we want as a means of achieving environmental outcomes. So I think we can say here that we can see again a support towards further public-private sector partnerships. Now, the mention of ecosystems in the context of these resolutions is also important, as it acknowledges the role of the environment in the provision of water services. The statement is clearly in line with the emergence of the concept of an ecosystem approach and the recognition of water supply as an ecosystem service. However, it again places emphasis on activities that occur within national boundaries, and of course we have to remember that most watersheds are of a transboundary nature. Interestingly, it does not indicate whether the part of the protection and sustainable management of these ecosystems involves the pricing of ecosystem services, the PES, as advocated in the controversial The Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity report. Wider green economy documents such as UNEP, Green Economy Report, and Measuring Water in a Green Economy have advocated this approach as part of the wider move towards the green economy, and this is an issue to which I would like to return. Now, the final two paragraphs make commitments with respect to infrastructure adaptation, natural disasters, and water quality. These are, of course, central to improve water supply. However, there's no specific link made in this section of the document or any other section of the document with directly between water supply and climate change. Whilst climate change is mentioned in other contexts, there isn't any sort of specific plan with respect to mitigation and adaptation measures for water supply. Now, addressing the impacts, I'm sure we all know, addressing the impact of climate change on water resources is fundamental going forward. Dan Tarlock has argued that from a water management perspective, the changing hydrological systems and the presence of climate change means that water managers are unable to rely upon the assumptions of regional water balances, and the current hydrological models may be unreliable and may cause problems in estimating available supplies. Briefly, before I go on to look at the green economy, I just want to mention that there are also 15 voluntary commitments made with respect to water at Rio. Most of these relate to raising awareness and expanding participation. Interestingly, one of the commitments made by the Ramsar Convention intends by 2012 to prepare a synthesis report on existing information on the TEEB for water and wetlands, again highlighting the TEEB's importance to the green economy. So what is the green economy and how does this impact water supply? Now, the green economy is both an objective and pathway towards sustainable development and poverty eradication. We can see from paragraph 56 from the Future We Want that the conference considered the green economy in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication as one of the important tools available for achieving these ends. Now, the Future We Want does not define the green economy, rather it classifies it as a tool focused on certain objects. The adoption of a green economy approach will clearly involve water supply. However, again, these objectives and these intentions are not outlined in the document. So to understand the nature of the green economy and its implications for water supply, I think it's important for us to look outside our Rio Plus 20. It's important to note that the green economy is not a creation of the conference, having been the centre of recent environmental policy debates and the subject of a number of UNEP initiatives. Now, UNEP defines the green economy as one that results in improved human well-being and social equity while significantly reducing environmental risks and ecological scarcity. Now, whilst UNEP stresses it doesn't replace sustainable development, there is an increased focus on the economy to achieve desired sustainability outcomes. The green economy is both to symbolically and physically replace the brown economy with the goal of achieving both long-term sustainability and the Millennium Development Goals. Now, conceptually, Jose Antonio argues that the concept of the green economy has gained support due to its capacity to respond to the many crises facing the world economy, providing an alternate paradigm to both growth and ecosystem protection. These solutions focus on both the immediate economic, so the economic credit crisis that many of the world's economies are now facing, and also the economic failures that have stemmed from the unequal allocation of resources, as evidenced by the current poverty crisis and also food shortages. Of course, the question remains whether the green economy can achieve its ambitious outcomes and how it will, in particular, interact with sustainable development. Its first challenge, however, must be said to be one of direction, as it is still unclear how the concept will apply to markets and ecosystems. Such concerns have been expressed by Martin Core, who views the green economy as a controversial, complex and uncertain concept, and one yet to receive widespread acceptance and still unable to provide any real direction in policy debates. The rhetoric of the green economy, however, has to be contextualised by the general failure of sustainable development over the past 2 decades to achieve its intended outcomes. Legally, sustainable development has received increasing recognition both at the domestic and the international level. However, as Karen Morrow argues, the current form of sustainable development, as described by the Brundtland Report, has failed in achieving its objectives, as it both has validated a business as usual approach, aiming to achieve the paradigms of economic growth, environmental protection, and equity simultaneously, and in effect have tried to reconcile the irreconcilable. The green economy, by comparison, appears even less capable of providing an equal balance between the competing challenges of interests of development and environment, as it shifts its focus further away from ecology and placing a greater emphasis on value and the ability of market mechanisms to deliver their outcomes. So what does this mean for water, and is there such a thing as green water? So as I've already mentioned, the future we want does not directly link the green economy with any specific area of environmental concern. However, it clearly is intended to engage with the media-specific issues. Now, water, as I said, is generally considered as being part of the green economy. However, the nature of this role remains undefined. So the key question that I really want to consider is, what does the green economy mean for water? I think we can see from the specific paragraphs that on water that I discussed earlier, that firstly we must accept that there's a plan for increased privatisation. Now, as I said, as I've already mentioned, it's specifically mentioned in the future we want as part of the green economy, and also encouraged with respect to water resources. So I think we can see that enhanced public-private partnerships may be viewed as a way going forward to enhance supply. However, aside from this, I think we again need to look outside the documentation of Rio Plus 20 and see what other bodies have had to say about the green economy. And I think some further insights can be drawn from UNEP, which argues that in green economies, the role of water in both maintaining biodiversity and ecosystem services, and in providing water is recognised, valued and paid for. The use of technologies will encourage efficient forms of recycling, and reuse is encouraged. In order to bring water into the green economy, UNEP estimates that it will require an additional investment of $191 billion a year until 2030, and $311 billion from 2030 to 2050. Now, clearly, for this investment to be successful, they'll have to, and to expand service provision, there's going to be a need to look at traditional and non-traditional funding sources to be able to meet this gap. The other issue that the funding needs to consider is how to overcome the current anthropogenic pressures on watersheds. As I'm sure you've all read the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report, it highlighted the continuing pressure that human activity is placing on watersheds, and highlighted the need for us not only to consider the water allocations that we need, but how we also need to deal with our impact on the environment to be able to achieve any form of sustainability. Now, traditionally, economic measures have been viewed as an effective tool to encourage decreases in pollution output and increased uptakes in water saving and recycling technologies. They have, however, always presented more of a challenge with respect to rationing and conservation. Subsidies, for example, may increase consumption, while allowing the true forces of supply and demand to determine price levels may leave some households being unable to afford the water that they need. There are also problems in place now with respect to allowing market forces to operate with legislative protections of minimum service levels and the right to water. Now, UNEP has also advocated the payment for ecosystem services and other consumer accreditation models as an important part of the green economy. And just in my final 2 minutes, I just want to discuss the issue of payment for ecosystem services, and what I really think is the key question as to whether this approach is going to form part of the green economy. Now, again, the payment for ecosystem services is not specifically mentioned in the future we want. However, it is strongly advocated in other green economy documents. And as part of the PES process, we have to look at the TEEB, which advocates the adoption of an ecosystem approach which elevates the flows of value to human societies as a result of the state and quality of natural capital. The TEEB also emphasises how placing value on ecosystems can assist decision makers determine the best use and scale of their economic resources. Now, from the perspective of water services, there are two types of payment for ecosystem services. Firstly, those financed by the user and those financed by the government or donor. UNEP argues that the most efficient form are those financed by the user, as they will be able to identify the services they want and the amount that they're willing to pay. Now, the PES are increasingly being applied already in South America and the Caribbean. For example, in Costa Rica, one of their public service utilities pays for watershed conservation by levying a conservation charge on consumers. And now, while the approach has the potential to include traditional externalities within pricing models, it's also been heavily criticised for the commodification of nature and also for adopting what can be viewed as an extremely anthropogenic approach. Now, since it's mentioned Karen Morrow again, she's argued that the TEEB report and more widely the PES approach fails to recognise the plurality of values ascribed to nature and is in effect trying to mainstream economic approaches such as the willingness to pay into environmental management. Clearly, this issue is really a challenge between reconciling our desire for environmental conservation and also more broadly issues of development. And this is clearly, I think, one of the challenges that the green economy faces going forward. Now, whilst the future we want maintains quite a narrow focus on water resources, it's clear that the inclusion of water in the green economy and the different aspects that this may bring into play, such as the payments for ecosystem services, may actually end up being the lasting legacy of Rio going forward. Now, very briefly, I just want to flag two challenges that I don't think have been particularly addressed by the future we want, or really any of the green economy documents. And I feel that these two issues present a potential challenge of applying market mechanisms to water services. Firstly, as a very traditional argument with respect to privatisation, water services are natural monopolies, and it's very difficult to change this. Water services are the classic example of where the total operation cost will always be lower when there's one consumer. It's very difficult to introduce competition, and it's very difficult to introduce trading mechanisms due to the immobility of infrastructure, and also the high cost of water infrastructure places substantial barriers into the market. And therefore, these natural monopolistic tendencies may prevent hindrances in applying the green model economy to water services. Secondly, there's no real renewable alternatives to water. So if the goal of the green economy is to change production from brown to green, we clearly need to be able to find an environmentally sustainable alternative. Now, whilst water usage can of course become more sustainable and more decreased, and placing less pressure on watersheds, there isn't actually, like energy, there isn't actually a separate product that we can use. And I feel that some of the rhetoric with the green economy may struggle with respect to some of the challenges unique to water supply. Thank you very much, and I'll be very interested to hear your thoughts on the issue.
Thank you, Rebecca. And we will now hear from our second speaker, Professor Nicola Logorese from Trento University in Italy. Oh, that came in? Sure, we had a couple people come in the room since we started, and we gave brief introductions just so that we all know names and affiliations and your interest in water. So I don't know if you have the back that came in.
I'm Melissa Powers. I'm at Lewis and Clark Law School, and I actually litigated water pollution issues for a long time, but now I'm more interested in the intersection of energy and water.
I'm Tracy Hester, University of Houston Law Center. I'm interested in water not only for water quality and pollution issues, but frankly because it's also evolving as the central choke point for all sorts of other issues, particularly power development and other environmental issues in the Texas area.
I'm Erin Daly, Widener Law School. I'm interested in the constitutional issues, and I'll be talking later on about constitutional water issues. So.
Okay. So, hello everyone, and flying in, I realized that my theme was too broad and that I had too many slides, and I spent the last 2 days, well, I went to the baseball game, but I spent the last 2 days in trying to rearrange and cut. But I'll be brief. Last year I wasn't brief and I couldn't tell my conclusions. So now I start from conclusions so that it's done, and then I can speak about other things. And my conclusion, I started with the crossroads theme of the conference, and crossroads 1 is about the roles of different governance levels, and I think that the regional level, I'm speaking about European Union and then Italy, is probably at this time the most effective level. Crossroads 2 is about implementing sustainable development from now on SD, because it's easier for me. And in this case, I think that the problem is to international law and administrative law to make the principle translated into public interests and then treated as such from the administrative law point of view. And Crossroads 3 is about economic analysis. We have talked on the first day about ecosystem services, and I think that it's necessary to understand issues, other issues, useful to evaluate, but not exhaustive to decide. So we shouldn't rely too much on economic analysis, and at least not only to economic analysis. And other conclusions, I see SD as a sort of big totem that whose pursuit path is over. So, and maybe what we knew about the Rio conference can confirm or not this. And at a national level, I'm speaking about Italy, it's often misunderstood or misused or simply useless, even because of rhetoric and demagogy. And so again, the regional level is more homogeneous and can translate the principle into policies and then into administrative implementation. And about water, the right to water is often seen as one right, it has very different meanings among countries and regions for a number of reasons, not just the SD pillars, but for cultural, political reasons. And in a developed country, social water issues are not about access or affordability, but are mainly about public service, welfare, not life, the cost of water, and not access to water. And then the last conclusion, administrative law, again, going from the very broad and abstract solidarity principle embedded in SD to efficiency and impartiality that are principle of administrative action. And so not just across all, it's quite complicated, and I couldn't resist, because when I found out that in the United States you call it spaghetti junction, well, and that explains why I don't eat spaghetti in the United States, because the concept. Anyway, some very fast notes about SD. Rebecca talked about that, and there was the plenary session. I would like to start from a document, The Future We Don't Want, that a group of NGOs wrote. So not what you can read, a very negative judgment, so promises, generic agendas. And if we read The Future We Want, we see a lot of paragraphs, 283, and we see 164 recognize and 60 reaffirm. So the future is much into the past of something that already happened. So probably the main point is the second paragraph about poverty, and the link between SD and poverty, and we'll see between water and poverty is the most interesting and unfortunately actual theme. And we see the IUCN vision, the prosperous world, a world without poverty, the harmony with nature, so this sort of fairy tale approach. And we can ask, well, but how? And how? Yes, it's probably what you are thinking, maybe. A new council, a new body, and new goals. So postponing again and creating something that we have seen in the past. So maybe this general statement and declaration, maybe we should try to find something different. In Italy, the situation is not better. I mean, we have SD embedded in our laws, not in our constitution. But what we find in the Environmental Code of 2006 is something very vague. Every legally relevant human activity must comply with SD. I mean, it's quite vague. And then there is a confusion between SD and environmental protection interest. In the same paragraph of an article, we shift from one to another without any explanation. And then the fact that SD must point out a resource balance. Okay, but you are the law that should find that balance. It's not that you can give this task to someone else. And then another nice thing to read, that controversies should solve ensuring SD, but again, how? And I haven't seen from 2006 any judicial decision recalling this part. And even in more recent legislation, we have Decreto Legge, an urgent piece of legislation, measures for growth for the economic crisis. And the label is sustainable development, but then we read all of this, it's about incentives, infrastructures, project financing, company law, competition, administrative justice. The point is that you put SD everywhere just because it is fancy. About the EU, we have a sort of declaration in the treaties, in the EU Charter. We have something more specific about internalizing and externalizing the environmental cost, promoting a market-based approach. We have some measuring, so there is a monitoring report every 2 years, which gives an assessment of the progress towards the objective of the European Union strategy on SD. We have communication. So we can see the results of the measuring with, I mean, this kind of sunny and cloudy. So water. Even with water, we have had a lot of celebrating. I mean, the decade, the year, the day of water. We have had a lot of talking. I mean, you can see all the declaration and the conferences. But we have had some goals that aren't going to be met. Drinking water may be on track. Sanitation is out of reach. And if you look at the Rio Plus 20, we have already seen them. Just one thing that I find the most interesting is that the focus on financial resources, especially in a crisis time, and the national priorities, which is linked again to the crisis with the crisis time. So one thing is to say that SD must be reached. One thing is to say there are serious financial problems in some countries. Last year I was talking about the referendum that in June 2011 were held in Italy about the privatization of water services and the profit on water services. And actually, it was against the favor for the privatization of water services and against the inclusion of private profit in water tariffs. But the meaning that was given to this referendum was, and the yes won, was that water is a fundamental right, and so it must be managed by public only, and there can't be any private or public profit on water. What happened 1 year later? Not much, because one thing is to expect these kind of results. One thing is to consider what is the really impact on the legislation. And one thing is to think about the financial outcome of such a change. So there is a water citizens initiative bill. I mean, citizens initiative bill in Italy have a 0.00 something chance of success, but politically they can mean something. And so there are interesting specific principles. I mean, it's stated the 50 liters per person per day right to water, and it's stated a different principle that beyond 300 liters per day per person, it's commercial use and it's not domestic use, it's not civil use. Then they say that there should be a national fund for international solidarity, so SD at its best. And then that there should be an immediate shift from public to private. Concessions and permits must be revoked, buying private shares in private companies. And again, the last point, that the water service financing should rely on tariffs, but also on general taxation. And you can realize what the last 2 points could mean under a financial point of view. And so what does the bill propose? Because in Italy, the new legislation should indicate the financial means for it. And you can read it. And 5% cuts in military expenses, and well, you can read. But what you see is something that, okay, it's strange that in a water law bill you have something about cutting military expenses. And then you can expect a military bill that will cut on water law, water expenses. Tax evasion recovery, it's something that we don't know. I mean, Italy is quite a big problem. And we don't know if we are going to get that. And so it's not something that we can count on. And for example, 10% of the VAT on bottled water. It's something that, something less that is entering to the balance of Italy. Anyway, so one thing is stating very nice principles or very revolutionary ideas. One thing is dealing with the practical matters. Besides, there can be some serious problems about European Union law, because Article 9 of the directive of year 2000 state full recovery of costs, and in this case there wouldn't be a full recovery of costs. And then as for the public-private partnership, you were talking about it, even at the European Union level, it's something that it's been favored or promoted. The EU contribution to Euro Plus 20 specifically talks about that. And so maybe the European Union level can be the right level, avoiding the very general principle on SD or even on water on one side, and the rhetoric and demagogic approach that sometimes at the country level you have. And so at the European Union we have a holistic and multi-level governance approach, but directed by the European Union. We have a different way, different territorial way of dealing with it, with the river basin district. And the standards of the directive of 2000, there is a standard, for example, of good status of water, which is, and if you read it, it is somehow fun, because the good status of water is when water status is good, which, but because it's a flexible and dynamic process through the common implementation strategy. So maybe it can be flexible, pragmatic, and the right level. Okay, I didn't even have the 2 minutes, so I can speak to you about something else. No, I prefer just to have some interaction. We should have the question time, but, well, even some coffee. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to have a nice chunk of time for some questions and answers, and I just wanted to sort of, I was really, so many themes were touched upon in these two talks, and I'm really excited to hear from you and your questions, but it seemed like one of the themes was the role of markets, the role of economics, this, how to reconcile privatization with the human right to water. How do we define the human right to water? How do we define sustainable development? I just attended a conference. I teach undergraduate students at the University of Maryland, and we just started at Maryland a sustainability minor. And I went to a 2-day course on sustainability, and we spent half of one day trying to define it. And I'm actually curious to ask Nicola how you define sustainable development in your statutes in Italy. But, and also this question of the level of governance. What is the most appropriate for water? Is it international governance and treaties? Is it this more of a regional approach, the EU framework directive, or country by country? The fact that this ecosystem, all these recognitions in the future we want that to the human right to water and to ecosystem protection, but yet you have to reconciling that with these issues of sovereignty. So I am going to turn it over to you for questions, because I hope that you have a number of them. So anyone want to start?
Enjoyed both your presentations very much, and I think in different ways both of you were talking about how many of us are struggling with the role or place of water in concepts like sustainable development, green economy, right to water. What does that mean? And I wanted to share an experience and then maybe get some feedback. There was a conference about a year ago, Pacific Northwest at Willamette Law School, about the right to water. And what was interesting as people began to talk about it, a lot of people at that conference thought framing the issue of a right to water was a really, really bad idea, at least in the context of the United States. It might make more sense in the developing world. And one of the heavy criticisms that came in for the whole idea, the concept of the right of water, is that it's a right to consume water. It's a right to use water out of stream. That's what it has been framed around. Who gets the water, drinking water supply, sanitation, and there did not seem to be a place right now in the concept of the right to water for in-stream uses. In-stream uses which obviously can affect water quality, but in-stream uses which very much relates to ecosystem services. And I guess what I just wanted to share that a lot of people who are very interested in water and ecosystems think the idea of framing this as a right to water has some real conceptual problems that need to be worked through, and that those problems in part relate to the fact that we're not having a frank discussion about in-stream uses of water for fisheries, ecosystem, water quality, and taking water out of stream for whatever those uses are, irrigation, drinking, and that I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the in-stream, out-of-stream aspects of this.
Thank you for your comment. I completely agree with you. I think the right to water, I think you can sort of say it certainly had a varying evolution in terms of the status of, and the strength of documents that have recognised it. And of course, 2000 and the content of each separate document that recognised it. General Comment 15 is one of the few that places an emphasis on quality, whereas most other documents will just place an emphasis on access. And of course, 2010, we all sort of threw up our hands and said, look what the UN said. But I'm not necessarily sure that we know, I completely agree with you, I'm not actually necessarily sure that we know what to do with it. I recently gave a paper in Oslo looking at its implementation, and I think in domestic legislation, I guess, is probably potentially the best way where we can see it, with anti-disconnection provisions, which will safeguard the minimum service level, of course, constitutional, and also constitutional recognition, and there are a number of different jurisdictions that have done so. But at the same time, when we start creating these safeguards, we are in effect also creating minimum extraction levels for watersheds, because we're guaranteeing a certain amount of water to each household, or to each individual, each household. And I think that the issue of quantification is very challenging, because I think if you look at the Free Basic Water Policy in South Africa, they've allocated 20 litres of water per person, but the basic minimum is, which is recognised by most people, is 50. And I don't have the number off the top of my head, but if we, and I'm not criticising the United States, all Western countries have very high water levels, water consumption levels, but it's, in the hundreds of litres a day, and it's very hard to reconcile what the right actually means. And I think you can sort of look at, there is a movement towards looking at the impact of the stream, but I don't necessarily think the right to water is the way to do that. I think I'm very strongly in favour of the ecosystem approach, and I think if you look at the Water Framework Directive, looking at ideas of ecosystem health and good water quality, I think that's maybe a potential move forward. And also in Australia and New South Wales, there's water regulation. There's also been concepts of environmental flows. And whilst there's been problems actually saying that they're high enough, I think the concept is really good. And I guess the challenge for us going forward is how we reconcile the right, when we only have a limited amount of water, reconcile the right with these other legislative approaches.
I think your point about sort of the right possibly leading to a minimum extraction level is spot on. And given, at least in the West, we're dealing with a lot of effort, certainly in California, to trying to implement minimum in-stream levels. So I think what the people, at least the conference that I was at, they weren't simply saying that the right to water is not necessarily a good place to deal with it. They were actually saying it might be at cross purposes with it, which I think is something different. And what we were talking about, and I don't know if this is where you're going, if I were a business that was involved in extraction of water for use, this notion of the right to water is really good news for me, because you might be talking about it as a human right, but if other people can sort of recast that human right as, our farmers, even if they're industrial farmers being wasteful, they have this right under international law to do this, or wasteful practices in the municipal sector. The opportunity for the concept of a right to water, at least in the more developed countries, to be horrendously co-opted in a way that doesn't fulfill public health and undermines effort to preserve aquatic ecosystems, I think is very real.
I agree with your notes. And
sorry to be cynical.
Notes, just a couple of things. The first is that on general terms, I'm not sure that the right to water was really a good idea. I mean, to state it, because it leads to a fragmentation of very important rights. I mean, if we have a right to life, a right to dignity, right to water is already embedded in that. So the risk is that we have a sort of excessive fragmentation. The second note is that the right to water is not about, in my view, about extraction, but it's simply to let every person have 50 liters or sometimes even less, like the case of South Africa. So it's mainly about that. But if you think about developed countries, I mean, in Italy the average consumption is 200 liters per day, while the right is 50 liters. So it can be good on a theoretical point of view to say, okay, the 50 liters we are not going to pay for that. But then the other, at least the liters after 100, or sure after 200, we have to pay much, much more, which is not what these people in Italy want, because it's something that, I mean, the 50 liters is not something that they are considering. So if we are going theoretical, then we have to follow that up. And the average price of water in Italy means that the 50 liters per day is 7-8 euro cents. I mean, 7 cents a day. So we are talking about something that affects very little the population. And so that's why I think that talking about the right to water is a bit in Italy, and maybe in other developed countries, is distracting from the real issues.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed both of your presentations. I also have some problems in terms of understanding the normative basis of this concept of sustainable development. It's an age-old question when we talk about human right to water. But how can we implement and how can we enforce it? And from international law perspective, when we talk about the state obligation, and then immediately there is a question that where do you get this from that the states have agreed to this concept of sustainable development? What is the normative basis of the sustainable development? And I have seen literatures, leaning towards the human rights aspect, to defend this idea that at least human rights, regimes are well developed. And in absence of any particular regime, we can get this sort of validity from human rights discourse. And it's particularly true in the case of developing countries where access is an issue, and also the question of distribution. Now, in this particular Rio 20 outcome, when we talk about the green economy, it seems to me that it's again very vague without providing any clear indication and what that economy will involve. Do we refer to this international political economy? And do we still refer to their instruments and the legal framework that we have? If we refer to that, the existing framework, in terms of the commercialization of the water services, it's regulated by, as you know, that the WTO agreement on trade and services, which is a binding agreement, and it has potential implications for the access and distribution. Now, as you mentioned, Rebecca, that it says traditionally it's in their state monopoly. But again, in WTO agreement, they provide some options for retaining that monopoly. But in effect, when you open up the market in the service sector, very little, domestic industries or corporations can compete against multinational corporations. So it has some effect on that monopoly, whether they can retain the capacity to ensure the distribution of water access to its people. When we talk about that we should ensure that everybody will have access to water. It's not a commodity. So that aspect is also challenged. But what I find it difficult, and I also wanted to get your input, that where to from here, when we have seen this traditional challenge, making a balance between this economy and ecology, and human rights, and also the economy, does it make any new does it provide any sort of new avenue or impetus or any guidance to deal with those traditional challenges, or are we talking about the same age-old question?
That's a very good question. As you probably gathered from my presentation, I'm not the biggest fan of the green economy. I tried to be fair and balanced. But at the same time, I think I completely agree. The challenge of sustainable development, and I'm trying to be completely cynical about it. I mean, I was genuinely thrilled, when the ICJ recognized it, discussed it in pulp mills. I thought that was a really positive step forward. But the trouble is, we have these step forwards. We've been recognising sustainable development for 20 years. We've been putting sustainability in legislation, we've been putting sustainability in water access agreements, the word. But to actually give effect to it, I don't think we always still necessarily know how to do it. Because of course the reality becomes that people want water. And of course a large part of water extractions are of course agricultural. That's another whole topic. But of course it does still feed into the water that's available for water supply, keeping sort of the focus quite narrow. And so in that sense, I don't think that sustainability has achieved what it should. And a lot of the background reading when I was looking about the green economy, really just trying to think about what it was. I think the future we want has made it clear that it's a tool. But before the future we want, some commentators were saying, well, is it a new sustainable development? Have we given up on sustainable development? Are we now trying the green economy because that's been such a disaster? And I don't actually really know what the green economy is going to add, because I think sustainable development, in terms of the three paradigms of Brundtland, I think it's already heavily skewed towards development, towards economy, and away from conservation. So I don't necessarily see why we need an economic tool to assist us achieving the objectives. And I think we're quite good at achieving the economic objectives, we're just not really good at achieving the environmental objective. And I think specifically with water, to draw upon what you were talking about, again, I completely agree with you, the challenge of the monopoly nature. I guess we can see, I was one that I've also had a look a bit at gas and water, and it anyone doesn't really seem to be really willing to engage in it. Yes, it's subject to it, but there aren't many countries making specific gas commitments with respect to their water services. And of course the question is it because it's really controversial and people do believe it's their right, and there could be a lot of public resistance towards trade commitments. I guess that's one issue. But the issue is secondly, water infrastructure. Most countries are struggling, developed countries are struggling to update their aging water infrastructure. They're struggling with leaks. And they can basically, in London recently, they're still trying to upgrade the Victorian water system. So the water pipes. In developed countries, most infrastructure is aging. And in developing countries, there needs to be more of it. And in this sense, it's a very massive challenge to then create. I know that there are legislative options around the world that have tried to increase competition, but it's really only at the edges in terms of, and I'm thinking of the Water Industry Competition Act again in New South Wales. You're trying to encourage recycling, you're trying in new new providers with respect to recycling, but you're not necessarily getting a second person, a second entity to be a competitive water supplier. And I think it's this massive infrastructure creates a sort of inertia that I think is a real, and I think, I mean, not necessarily saying there aren't challenges with renewable energy in the green economy, I think there are, but if you read the documents, it's certainly, not to make it sound weird, but it's certainly the sort of the test case, sort of the poster area for the green economy, because you can see that there is a more renewable option. But I don't see, I'm really struggling, and I guess what my paper really was trying to think through the implications to South and Rio, but I do see real problems with how we can't make sustainability work effectively. I don't see how the green economy is going to add much.
Yeah, it's difficult to add something, but I agree. And no, about the green economy, I share the same doubts and fears. I mean, green economy should have been embedded already in sustainable development. So my fear is that there is another mirage that we use nice words, and then in 20 years there is a green economy plus 20. About the problem of monopoly, again, I can tell you about the Italian case. The debate is about water should be managed by public or private, and it's very polarized as the discussion, as many things are in Italy. Because some of them say, okay, private companies are water thieves, and others say public is inefficient, is just a waste of money. And again, maybe administrative law would help, meaning that you should just compare the two options and have an administration that can control private entities, really control, which was what was missing so far, at least in Italy, or to have efficient management from public entities. There is a sort of paradox too, because if you live where there is an efficient administration, probably both options will work. While if the local public administration is not efficient, probably both will fail. So that's a big problem.
Other hands raised over here. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentations. That was very excellent. I'd like to add something to what Nicola said. What I found interesting is that in both your presentation, at some point, the term privatization sneaked in. Kind of, it's from a first point of view, this has nothing to do with sustainability of water resources. And what was interesting then in your slide, Nicola, that there is a broad public opposition against privatizing water in any way. So what I was wondering is why don't we emphasize the command and control aspect more often in this scenario? Actually, the success story in water law has been a rather brutal command and control situation, at least in Europe with the Water Framework Directive, and the classic instrument of emission limit values, and the classic instrument of the public authority distributing rights to water, but limiting them in time. So I also see what your comment was, if we start about constitutional rights to use of water, I could easily see what some are able to make of it. So how do you explain that this term of privatization, where does that come from? I do not quite see a coherent legal background for having to have that with regards to the law of water. I do not quite see a stringent development within the concept of sustainable development, that this can only be done or can best be done by privatization. So that seems to be a concept that is not really intrinsic within this area of law, but nevertheless it comes in these documents at a certain level.
Yeah. I think that sneaks in because the problem is to have financial means. So the privatization, at least in Italy and in other countries, was because there were no financial means to intervene on infrastructures, and water infrastructures are quite costly. So it was I needed to have money. Then there can be other ideological reasons for or against privatizations, but how it meeting was about finding money, and even in some documents that we showed, you see that there is attention for financial funding or new financial paths. So that's why. And again, I think that it's my position. It's not private is good or private is bad. I mean, you mentioned the command and control is something that exists and it worked, but still you can see the European Union policy that we have had a change. So command and control should be there, but then there should be something else, changing behaviors, and even the water framework directive has a different approach from the previous water directives, so having less stringent emission limits or some concepts that would develop without the numbers, just the good status of water is an example.
I was just thinking, there's I think it's a couple of years old now, an article by James Salzman talking about the evolution of water privatisation. He goes back looking at the original privatisation providers, which were, off the top of my head, I haven't read in a while, would have been in sort of 19th century New York and 19th century London. And basically, as he argues, the privatisation, because there was no public supply, the private sector was called upon to put in pipes in wealthy areas, and eventually its failure led to failure of the water company, particularly in New York, led to the government stepping in and then undertaking privatisation. But of course, part of privatisation must be accepted as ideological, because it's since the 19th century we've gone from holistic state ownership back to we're sort of in a wave of privatisation really since you can say the rise of neoliberalism in what we sort of say the 1970s. So really there is a cyclical and ideological nature as well. And what I was just thinking, in terms of it's sort of popping its head up, I completely agree, it just pops its head up occasionally. In terms of popping its head up with respect to the future we want particularly, and also the Johannesburg plan of implementation, is that we really are with the move away from environment to sustainable development to the green economy. We really are engaging more in market mechanisms, and so as part of that cycle, privatisation is sort of a core in that, and in the sense it will inherently pop its head up when we're going through this sort of wave of economic and economic sort of movements at the moment.
I think we are about out of time. I'm sure everyone is ready for lunch. So thank you for an informative panel and an inquisitive audience. And